Hi, today I want to talk about the paucity regarding the construction of masculinity and the public silences around diverse male sexualities and sexual practices. And I'm going to be using Amir Soltani and Khalil Bendib's graphic novel titled Yusuf and Farhad Struggling for Family Acceptance in Iran, the story of two gay men. The graphic novel breaks the silence on diverse male sexualities and redefines masculinity as non-singular rather than the outcome of a biological construction. The graphic novel chronicles the struggles of a gay man called Yusuf after coming out to his family. Yusuf and his lover Farhad are exposed to harassment and violence after revealing their true sexual orientation. They appeal for acceptance to their family and society, but they are rejected and abandoned. The graphic novel illustrates that central to the um, construction of the dominant heterosexual middle class masculinity is the subordination of the gay masculinity as a repository for everything that heterosexual masculinity deems as weak and feminine. This subordination of gay masculinity normalizes heterosexuality while deeming homosexuality as abnormal. Regardless of the fact that the title of the graphic novel and the storyline revolve around the relationship between Yusuf and Farhad, the character who provides the reader with the most pertinent characteristics regarding the question of masculinity is Yusuf's father, Mr. Jafari. Although Mr. Jafari does not fit into the traditional constructed category of a protagonist, he is not entirely an individual antagonist either. He can, however, be considered as the embodiment of heterosexual homophobic masculinity. Of course, Mr. Jafari is not the archetypal representation of the community's hegemonic masculinity. However, in his capacity as the head of the family and Yusuf's father, he can implement power over Yusuf. As Connell points out, and I'm quoting here, the public face of hegemonic masculinity is not necessarily what powerful men are, but what sustains their power and what large numbers of men are motivated to support, end quote. So the preferred hegemonic masculinity is an unattainable ideal that most men representing sub-hegemonic masculinities strive for. Hegemony is established through the correspondence between cultural ideal and institutional power, which claims authority. These dominant masculinities are those that benefit from the patriarchal dividend of the instituted hegemony, while not being subject to the risk of those few that do embody the wholly archetypal exemplar of that hegemony. Mr. Jafari falls into this category of masculinities. Since masculinity is also culturally specific, let's look at the definitions and construction of masculinity in the Middle Eastern and Muslim societies. The ideal of masculinity in Muslim societies generally, and particularly in Iran, revolves around the institution of family and procreation. That is, a man is expected to marry, have a wife, and father a child. So here I'm quoting Malihe Aslam. The most central and almost universal expectation from the masculine gender is to be and to perform like a breadwinner. Men fall down the appropriate gender order if they fail to fit into this assigned gender role. And then I'm also quoting Amanullah Dasandi. Masculinity is constructed around the tenets of power, and the powerful needs a power base. In the lives of the Muslim men, this locus has become the heterosexual family. And since homosexuality is not a topic of discussion or debate in countries like Iran, um, in Alcia Seraj's words, the accommodation of deviant identities is considerably more difficult in these countries where Islam predominates, and the subject continues to be clouded in ignorance and in intentional neglect. Indeed, the traditional and the and the continued silence on the issue of homosexuality prevents many with homosexual feelings from identifying themselves publicly. And in such societies, according to Sidman, the dramatic quality of privately and publicly coming to terms with a contested social identity is more often than not accompanied with violence and disavowal from family and society. So here I try to basically give you an overview of what masculinity is and the construction of masculinity and its definition is based on in the Middle Eastern cultures and in Muslim societies. Now let's turn to the graphic novel itself, and I want to actually share with you some of the panels from the graphic novel, so you can see what when I'm discussing these panels in terms of my arguments and what I'm trying to portray, to show about the masculinities. So in Yusuf and Farhad, once Mr. Jafari becomes aware of Yusuf's homosexuality, he reacts in a way that he exerts his hegemonic power position immediately. In this figure 1, we can see that Mr. Jafari has just become aware of Yusuf's relationship with Farhad. He slaps Yusuf, condemns him for his correspondences with Farhad, and throws him out of his house. Soon after confronting Yusuf, Mr. Jafari degrades him, his and Farhad's poetic correspondences, calling them filth. He physically eliminates his son from his life, tearing down the posters and impetuously throwing Yusuf's belongings out in the street. In order to further assert his son's subordinate position, Mr. Jafari humiliates Yusuf, and by throwing him out on the street in the rain, solidifying his position as the dominant heterosexual male as well as the patriarch of the family. So this illustrates that to the heterosexual Mr. Jafari, homosexual masculinities fall at the bottom of the gender hierarchy and must be subordinated. To him, his son's sexual orientation is what is banished from hegemonic definitions of masculinity. This is what Desundi discusses as the hierarchy of masculinities in Islam, referring to, and I'm quoting here, the prophetic tradition that places emphasis on the valiant and heroic form of Islamic masculinity above the more softer form of Islamic masculinity. And this is the end of the quote. That traditionally portrays the partially subjective to suit the needs and desires of individuals who choose as they desire. So in fact, Mr. Jafari's understanding of his son's gayness falls along those lines of those binary lines which are distorted with homophobic notions that consider male homosexuality as the softer type of masculinity parallel to femininity. And again, I'm quoting from C.S. Raj, who says that heterosexist norms construct heterosexual masculinity based upon a static binary of male-female. The antithesis of this construct is, in effect, the homosexual male. So again, through his self-identification, the homosexual male basically challenges the dominant gender binary and disrupts this hegemony. So in the context of Iran, we have Afsaneh Najmabadi, who also argues that what made homosexuality, and I'm quoting, a cultural assault and moral insult in Iran was the shame of being exclusively receptive of anal penetration. And that's the end of the quote. And given the story was allotted a mere 20 pages for the tale of the events to unfold, Yusuf is almost immediately painted in a passive receptive manner in the relationship. So such expediency helps explicate why Mr. Jafari deems Yusuf's actions defaming towards the family reputation, as well as actions that are not worthy of a living person. So Mr. Jafari's attitude is mirrored in another encounter Yusuf has when a passerby in a vehicle approaches him as he's wandering on the street as a homeless youth, and the driver yells at Yusuf, hey, good looking, how much? And when Yusuf denies giving his attention to this driver, the driver angrily responds to Yusuf saying, you filthy homo, you're too good for me. Correspondingly, when Yusuf is thrown out on the street by his father, the neighborhood kids proceed to call him a faggot. And we can see in figure 2, this is after his he has been thrown out on the street by Mr. Jafari, and he's exposed to verbal harassment by the neighbors on the street. So these instances reify the lack of humanity and masculinity culturally associated with male homosexuality. The belief that the passive receptive partner deserves condemnation is consistent with the pre-modern Arabo-Muslim and Greek discourses on same-sex desire and relations with regard to, quote unquote, a preference for the passive receptive role in sexual intercourse as the very antithesis of masculinity. Such discourses emphasize the importance of positionality, that is the active-passive role of the participant in the relationship. In pre-modern Arabo-Muslim societies, the role of the passive penetrated was perceived to be either feminine, diseased, pathological condition, or a great sin, as it was assumed the penetrated or passive partner enjoyed the act. Traditional Arabic medical discourse, also following the Greek, regarded a man who desired to be penetrated as being afflicted with a disease with prescribed remedies. This was considered an innate condition and was called ugna. The individual afflicted with the disease was called ma'boon and was, quote unquote, perceived as being at odds with the ideal of masculinity. The belief in female passive and male active gender roles continues to this day, as Najmabadi remarks that this gender binary renders any fissures in hegemonic masculinity as effeminization. So while discussing his son's homosexuality, not only does Mr. Jafari consider Yusuf as feminine, that is the passive receptive partner, but also He declares that his son has an incurable disease. Talking to Miriam and Zahra about his son, Mr. Jafari uses the past tense, completely dissociating himself from Yusuf. He considers Yusuf's sexuality and vivacious self-embracement as a prudent attempt to defame and detract from his family honor, and thus an unbelievable embarrassment in his life, asking, "How could you be so selfish, my son?" When Yusuf attempts to commit suicide, it is even additional impudence and disgrace to Mr. Jafari, who remarks while sitting in the hospital waiting room that first dishonor and not this. And a comment, a very sensitive when put it alongside the one that he previously mentioned to Zahra and Miriam, suggesting that Mr. Jafari's life would be painless if Yusuf was actually dead. So Yusuf's suicide was a failed one. Um, this is when Miriam reminds Mr. Jafari to be thankful that Yusuf is actually not dead. Yusuf's coming out and public act of subversion through suicide is what Mr. Jafari believes has brought shame and dishonor to the family. Not only does Mr. Jafari view Yusuf as the passive receptive partner in his relationship, he also perceives Yusuf's suicide attempt as a weak and thereby a non-masculine act. He repudiates Yusuf's humanity by even refusing to name him. When asked who is this while looking at the torn fragments of Yusuf's photograph, he answers that he has no name. Now, this dismissive attitude persists throughout the graphic novel. Mr. Jafari's disinterest in acknowledging Yusuf's identity is parallel to renouncing Yusuf altogether from the Jafari family. In this way, Yusuf is stripped from his familial and social identity. And while Mr. Jafari is the one who estranges Yusuf from his family, he is also the one character who is recognized only by his last name, and he is denied a first name, and is addressed by the honorific Mr. throughout the graphic novel. Mr. Jafari's lack of identity, however, has a contrastive effect here, which makes him to be easily generalized as the representation of Iranian hegemonic masculinity. Now, Mr. Jafari's prejudice and homophobic attitude are set at odds with his brother Taimur's acceptance and support for his nephew. Taimur becomes the voice of reason and wisdom for Yusuf's father as he points out the hypocrisy in the fact that Mr. Jafari had premarital sex with his wife, because they were so in love. For Yusuf's uncle, true love is true love, whether between a man and a woman or a man and a man. Yusuf's uncle draws connection between Yusuf's parents' premarital sex and Yusuf's homosexuality, questioning Mr. Jafari's beliefs about the superiority of iteration of one love over the other. The two Mr. Jafaris, the two brothers, Mr. Jafari and Taimur, his brother, even their physical appearances are juxtaposed significantly, and I will discuss this later. Taimur is tall, broad, muscular, wearing a full beard, whereas Mr. Jafari is short, thin, gaunt-looking with a thin mustache. While Taimur is respectively employed in his own print and copy store and internet cafe, Mr. Jafari drives a taxi, which he parallels with a coffin and which is frequently associated with the lower income class of the society. The contrast between the two brothers illustrates that the relationship between the dominant and subordinate group is not a fixed one. So this is very fluid. In particular situation, the power structure changes. This is crystallized in the scene where, in this one, where another irritated driver confronts Mr. Jafari and proceeds to call him a faggot. So Mr. Jafari, who called his own son a faggot, now is being called a faggot by another man. This figure 3 is when the tables are turned and this driver calls him a faggot, and this name calling drives Mr. Jafari mad, and he treats the other driver violently. This greatly insults him and results in a physical confrontation. Even though Mr. Jafari holds and exercises power in society for being heterosexual, at any point he too might be exposed to subordination by other masculinities that are higher than he is on the hierarchy. However, these subordinations do not mean that those who are subordinate submit to the power structure. Yusuf's abrupt yet forced departure from home suggests his departure from the traditional male role and rejection of conformity. So Yusuf does not submit to this subordination and to this hierarchy of masculinities. Yusuf's father, Mr. Jafari, not only forces Yusuf out of a private space where his sexuality is no longer secret, but he also crumbles Yusuf's poems and throws them outside of his home on the street. While walking in the rain, as I mentioned before, Yusuf receives insults and gossip from the neighborhood. And at this point in his mind, Yusuf notes a line from the well-known 13th century Persian poet Sa'di Shirazi, and I'm quoting. This is what Yusuf reads in his mind. I am in love with all of creation, for all of creation emanates from the Creator. So, unable to retort vocally, Yusuf chooses to embrace chooses not to embrace the typical masculine emotions of anger, but he chooses to cling to his own definition of masculinity, while at the same time rejecting society's identification of him as a faggot. So as in a safer space, Yusuf chooses the third space of writing where he can embrace his own definition of masculinity. And he writes a basically letter to his family and to the society. And the line of poetry that Yusuf reads in his mind is also suggestive of Yusuf's choice of love through Sufism, because this is a line in Sufism that loving all humans, all creations, is basically a doorway to loving the divine. And all creations are beautiful and emanations of the beauty of the divine. So Mr. Jafari's denial and this avowal creates the possibility for Yusuf to redefine his masculinity. Now, I want to focus on some of the bodily features of these characters, and in the graphic novel, the visuals and the paintings. Whether the authors intentionally present stereotypical features or not, the characters' outward appearances disclose much about their sexual orientation. Conventional beliefs dictating that a man who is gay should perform his sexual identity through makeup or hairstyle form much of the public's misperception about the gay community. Now, in the graphic novel, the characters' physical features, especially the use of feminine features for Yusuf and for Yusuf and Farhad are exaggerated. One aspect of this illustration is the use or the lack of facial hair and beard. Historically, in the Muslim world, beards and mustaches have been viewed as the most visible characteristics of masculinity and male honor. Now, Sultani and Bendib's unbearded characters, Yusuf and Farhad, challenge this notion of dominant masculinity. In contrast, the other males of the graphic novel, that is the heterosexual males, sport facial hair, mustaches, and beards. Bendib chooses to omit facial hair on his protagonist so as to draw on the typical stereotypes and perceptions of homosexuality as feminine. On the other hand, a beard and mustache, or both features, adorn his heterosexual masculine subjects' faces. Now, interestingly enough, however, Mr. Jafari and the stranger who harasses Yusuf on the street lack a beard. And this is clear in figure 4, the one that I have here. Yusuf is wandering on the street after being thrown out of his house. And this is the moment that he is verbally harassed by this man, and he spends time with stray dogs and sleeps on the bench in a park over the night using Kayhan, the state-run newspaper Kayhan, as a blanket. So this, as you can see, this stranger, the driver, is boasting a thin, well-groomed mustache, whereas Mr. Jafari, from our previous panels, is used to wearing a thick, untrimmed mustache. Let me bring Mr. Jafari back and show you his mustache. You can see Mr. Jafari in these pictures. So this is very clear in this panel that Mr. Jafari's mustache is very thick and untrimmed, while this stranger who also got into a fight with Mr. Jafari is wearing a goatee and a mustache, and the stranger who calls Yusuf a faggot also is wearing a trimmed and thin mustache. So as he's walking on the street, Yusuf becomes the object of this much older man's desire. When Yusuf rejects him, he calls Yusuf a filthy homo, as I mentioned previously. Yusuf's clean-shaven face provokes the driver's stereotypical understanding of male homosexuality. It is also important to note that this older man's comment is a reference to a certain population of heterosexual men who, besides their heterosexual marriages and families, have tendencies for homosexual sex as well. Ironically, Mr. Jafari lacks what Yusuf and Farhad lack, a beard. These contrasting bodily representations are an apropos reminder of the discourse that to shape his own subjectivity, a heterosexual individual needs an abject other. Here I'm quoting Judith Butler. The forming of a subject requires an identification with the normative phantasm of sex. And this identification takes place through a repudiation which produces a domain of abjection, a repudiation without which the subject cannot emerge. So in addition to their facial hair, Yusuf and Farhad are characterized with, you can see in figure 5, with their long eyelashes, sensual quasi-feminine lips, and fluid curves. Their long, slender fingers intertwine and embrace one another. In the scene where Yusuf and Farhad rekindle their love under the night sky, which is this portrayed in this figure, figure 5, Both gaze at the other with large, beautiful narcissus eyes during their night together. This image depicts the intimate moment between Yusuf and Farhad in the mountains. Here they use symbolic religious and Sufi language as well. But Yusuf and Farhad are not exclusively drawn here with feminine physical traits, an attempt for the authors to break away with the stereotypes. In their intimate night in the mountains within their own private space, Yusuf and Farhad are shown to embody broad, muscular physique and hairy arms. Their fit, muscular bodies differ, of course, from the jolly, curvy, husky bodies of Yusuf's uncle Taimur. Their bodies also differ from Yusuf's scrawny, angular father. However, Bandit does not zoom in on the eyes or lips of his masculine heterosexual men. Rather, Mr. Jafari's thick eyebrows and angular face are emphasized. This contrasting aesthetic of Yusuf and Farhad and the heterosexual males of the story are another attempt to show the prevalent hierarchy within the masculinities and to disclose the public's stereotypical perceptions of the gay community and to break away from the conventional perceptions in society. Through image and text in this graphic novel, the authors basically try to emphasize that, and here I'm quoting, both masculinity and femininity are learned performances, affected but not dictated by genetics and societal expectations, with as many nuances and meanings as there are individuals who adopt, embody, and redesign them.